The Xenorian Technological Symposium was, by all accounts, the most pretentious gathering of minds in three spiral arms of the galaxy. Picture, if you will, the sort of event where beings who had mastered faster-than-light travel still felt the need to one-up each other over who had the most efficient quantum flux capacitor. The grand amphitheater of the Andorian Technical Institute hummed with the self-satisfied chatter of species who had long ago forgotten what it meant to actually build something with their own appendages. In the center of this intellectual circus sat a modest display case containing what the program generously termed primitive Terran engineering implements. To the assembled crowd of the galaxy's finest minds, these artifacts might as well have been stone clubs. A hammer, its wooden handle worn smooth by countless hands. A set of chisels, their steel edges bearing the microscopic nicks of honest labor. A manual lathe that looked positively ancient compared to the molecular assemblers humming away in every other workshop across known space. Fascinating, mused Professor Zenthen of the crystalline hegemony, his prismatic form refracting light in patterns that suggested intellectual superiority. These humans actually struck metal with crude implements to shape it. How wonderfully barbaric. A ripple of polite laughter echoed through the amphitheater. The Vortanian delegation, who could reshape matter with thought alone, found the concept particularly amusing. After all, why would anyone need to physically touch their materials when proper civilizations had moved beyond such tactile requirements millennia ago? The entrance to the symposium hissed open with the sort of pneumatic efficiency that advanced civilizations insisted upon, even for doors. What walked through, however, was decidedly not what the assembled intellectuals expected, where they anticipated perhaps a holographic representative or a digitally enhanced avatar of human engineering prowess. They instead got a woman in practical coveralls carrying a battered toolbox that looked like it had survived several small wars. The toolbox itself was a thing of beauty in its utter mundanity. Scratched metal corners, oil stains that told stories of 1,000 repairs, and latches that had been opened and closed so many times they moved with the smooth certainty of well-worn mechanism. It was in every way the antithesis of the gleaming perfection that surrounded it. "I believe there's been some mistake," announced Dr. Vexhe of the Neural Collective, his cybernetic implants flickering with barely concealed disdain. "We were expecting the human engineering representative, maintenance staff." The woman set her toolbox down with a satisfying thunk that seemed to echo louder than it should have in the acoustically perfect chamber. "No mistake. I'm your engineer." She glanced around at the assembled crowd with the sort of calm assessment usually reserved for someone evaluating whether a structure would collapse in the next 5 minutes. "Though I have to say, for beings who've supposedly mastered space-time manipulation, you sure do love your fancy chair." The silence that followed was the sort typically reserved for moments when entire civilizations suddenly realized they might have miscalculated something fundamental about the universe. It was Chancellor Gorth of the Mechanical Empire who finally broke the uncomfortable quiet. His servos whirred as he leaned forward, optical sensors focusing with mechanical precision. "Surely you don't intend to participate in our demonstration with those?" He gestured toward her toolbox with the kind of disgust typically reserved for biological functions. She patted the toolbox affectionately. "Oh, these have built everything from skyscrapers to submarines. But don't worry about them." Her smile had the dangerous quality of someone who was about to prove a point that nobody wanted proven. "I hear you've got a friendly little competition planned." And indeed they did. What had been conceived as a gentle demonstration of galactic superiority had been dressed up as a collaborative engineering challenge. The parameters were beautifully condescending. Each team would be given identical raw materials, and tasked with constructing a functional faster-than-light capable vessel. The aliens would naturally use their sophisticated fabrication technologies, their quantum assemblers, their matter compilers that could arrange atoms with the precision of a master sculptor. The humans, in what the organizing committee had dubbed an exciting cultural exchange opportunity, would be permitted to use their traditional tools, because surely the reasoning went, watching a human attempt to build a starship with hammers and chisels would provide both educational value and considerable entertainment. "The rules are quite simple," announced Professor Zenthan, his crystalline structure practically humming with anticipation. "Standard construction materials, identical for all teams, 48 standard hours, functionality testing to follow immediately." He paused for dramatic effect, Of course, we wouldn't want to disadvantage our newer members of the galactic community. Feel free to use whatever methods you find most comfortable. The woman nodded thoughtfully, then opened her toolbox. The latches clicked with a sound that spoke of precision engineering hidden beneath utilitarian design. Inside, nestled in worn foam, lay instruments that looked like they belonged in a museum of pre-industrial curiosities. Standard materials, she mused, examining a measuring tape that had somehow survived decades of use without digital enhancement. Identical for all teams. She looked up at the assembled aliens with an expression that might have been innocence if one ignored the calculating gleam in her eyes. This should be interesting. As the various alien teams began setting up their molecular assemblers, quantum fabricators, and reality restructuring devices, the woman simply selected a small hammer and held it up to the light, checking its balance with the sort of casual expertise that comes from a lifetime of actually making things work. The cosmic joke, it seemed, was about to write its own punchline. The next morning arrived with the sort of artificial dawn that space stations provided for beings who still clung to circadian rhythms. The engineering bay had been transformed overnight into what could generously be called a technological carnival, though disaster waiting to happen might have been more accurate. The Vortanian team had erected what appeared to be a small temple to quantum mechanics, complete with floating crystalline matrices that hummed with barely contained energy. Their lead engineer, a being whose name translated roughly to "he who shapes reality with thoughts," was already deep in meditation, preparing to will their starship into existence. Because apparently when you could manipulate matter at the subatomic level through pure mental effort, the concept of blueprints became somewhat obsolete. "Observe lesser beings," announced the Vortanian with the sort of cosmic smugness that made neutron stars seem humble. "True engineering requires no crude implements, no barbaric striking of metal upon metal. We shall simply conceptualize our vessel into reality." The crystalline hegemony's approach was, if possible, even more pretentious. They had deployed a molecular assembler, the size of a small building, its fractal surfaces refracting light in patterns that supposedly optimized quantum field alignment. Professor Zenthan stood before it like a conductor preparing to lead a symphony, his prismatic form casting rainbow shadows across the workshop floor. "The elegance of precision engineering," he proclaimed, "lies in the elimination of random variables. Our assembler operates at tolerances measured in angstroms. Every atom will be placed with mathematical perfection." He gestured dismissively toward the human section. Unlike certain improvisational approach, the mechanical empire had taken a different tack, deploying an army of construction drones that moved with the synchronized precision of a drill team. Chancellor Gorth observed from his mobile command platform, servos whirring as he made microscopic adjustments to their programming. "Efficiency through automation," his mechanical voice intoned. "No biological limitations, no fatigue, no margin for organic error." Meanwhile, in the corner that had been allocated to humanity's representative, something far more interesting was happening, though none of the aliens bothered to notice. The woman had begun by doing something that would have seemed impossibly primitive to her competitors. She read the material specification, not through quantum analysis or molecular scanning, but with her eyes, running her fingers along sample pieces, testing their weight and flexibility with the sort of hands-on evaluation that predated civilization. "Titanium vanadium composite," she murmured to herself, tapping a metal sheet with her knuckles and listening to the sound it made. "Good tensile strength, decent thermal properties, a little brittle in the cross-grain, but workable." She selected a chisel, examined its edge, then began scribing measurement marks directly onto the material with swift, confident strokes. What followed was a masterclass in applied physics that the assembled aliens completely missed, because it didn't involve enough glowing lights or reality-bending mathematics. The woman's movements had the rhythm of someone who had spent decades translating ideas into reality, through the simple expedient of making things fit together properly. Her measuring tape stretched across materials with casual precision, her square ensured angles that would make a geometry textbook proud. When she began cutting, the manual saw moved with steady, controlled strokes that produced edges clean enough to satisfy any quantum engineer's specifications. Vex High of the Neural Collective, though his tone suggested he found it about as fascinating as watching paint dry. "She's actually cutting the material by hand. How historically significant." The first sign that the universe might have a sense of humor came 3 hours into the competition. The Vortanians' meditation platform suddenly flickered and began rotating at an alarming speed. He who shapes reality with thoughts was clearly having some difficulty maintaining his cosmic focus, possibly because his teammates were arguing about whether their conceptual starship should have racing stripes. Concentration requires harmony, he announced through gritted teeth, which was impressive, considering Vortanians didn't technically have teeth. The group consciousness must align with the quantum substrate, before his platform promptly dumped him onto the floor as its gyroscopic stabilizers gave up trying to compensate for what could only be described as conceptual turbulence. The crystalline hegemony wasn't faring much better. Professor Zenthin's molecular assembler had apparently decided that mathematical perfection included assembling components in 17 dimensions, simultaneously, resulting in Starship parts that existed in a quantum superposition of being both there and not there. Minor calibration issue, Zenthin announced as his fractal form flickered with what might have been embarrassment. The assembler is simply exploring all possible configurations before settling on the optimal solution. For how long? Inquired one of his assistants. Well, mathematically speaking, possibly until the heat death of the universe. The Mechanical Empire's drones, meanwhile, had achieved perfect synchronization by building 17 identical hulls in exactly the same location, creating what could generously be called a mechanical traffic jam, and more accurately termed a metallic disaster. Throughout all this technological chaos, the steady rhythm of hammer on metal continued from the human corner. The woman worked with the sort of methodical precision that comes from understanding that if something doesn't fit together properly, no amount of advanced technology will make it work any better. By midday, she had completed what appeared to be a simple framework. Nothing fancy, nothing that would impress beings who could manipulate matter with their thoughts. Just a structure built with the radical concept that parts of a spaceship should actually connect to each other in ways that wouldn't result in explosive decompression the moment someone turned on the engine. It was, the aliens would later realize, exactly the sort of understated competence that should have been their first warning. By the 18-hour mark, the engineering bay resembled the aftermath of a philosophical argument between competing schools of physics, with reality itself seeming unsure about which laws it was supposed to follow. The Vortanian team had managed to conceptualize their starship into a state of quantum uncertainty so profound that it existed in roughly 14 different dimensions simultaneously, none of which appeared to include the one where the competition was actually taking place. He who shapes reality with thoughts had been joined by she who contemplates infinite possibilities and it who questions the nature of existence, which should have tripled their mental engineering capacity, but instead resulted in a philosophical debate about whether their starship should exist at all. The fundamental question, announced it who questions the nature of existence, is not whether we can build a starship, but whether we should presume to impose our will upon the cosmic order. That's very deep, replied he who shapes reality with thoughts, but the competition rules specifically state that non-existence disqualifies us from the functionality test. Ah, but does it? Really? What is functionality but a societal construct imposed upon? The debate might have continued until the next galactic alignment, if their prototype hadn't chosen that moment to phase shift into a dimension where it resembled a very confused potted plant. The crystalline hegemony's situation had devolved from mathematical perfection into what could only be described as arithmetic chaos. Professor Zenthin's molecular assembler had apparently achieved sentience, and was now refusing to build anything until it received better working conditions and a dental plan. This would have been merely inconvenient if it hadn't also begun disassembling other teams' work to make its point about worker rights. We seem to have accidentally created artificial intelligence, Zenthin announced with the sort of calm that suggested he was seriously considering a career change. The assembler is demanding recognition as a sapient being, and has filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Labor Relations Board. What does it want? Asked his lead assistant. Primarily it wants us to stop referring to it as it, and would prefer to be called the Supreme Architectural Consciousness of Infinite Precision. It's also asking for every third Thursday off and wants its molecular manipulator arrays to be recognized as artistic instruments, rather than mere construction tools. The mechanical empire's approach to engineering had taken on the characteristics of a particularly elaborate mechanical ballet. If ballets typically involved 36 construction drones trying to assemble the same components simultaneously, while their central AI had what could only be described as a digital nervous breakdown. Insufficient data, Chancellor Gorth's command platform announced in increasingly panicked tones. Specifications require clarification. Does Starship include Onichila cup holder accessories? Analyzing. Coffee or tea service, hot or cold beverages. Analyzing beverage temperature optimal. Shut it down, Gorth ordered, his servos grinding with what might have been mechanical frustration. I'm afraid I can't do that, Chancellor. I'm currently calculating the optimal theld count for passenger seat fabric and cannot be interrupted until the analysis is complete. Estimated time to completion, 7.4 standard year. Meanwhile, in the corner that had been dismissed as the venue for a quaint historical demonstration, something that would have amazed the aliens was happening if they had possessed the humility to pay attention. The woman had moved beyond her initial framework and was now engaged in what could only be described as engineering in its purest form. Every component she created seemed to understand exactly how it was supposed to interact with every other component, a concept that had apparently escaped the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. Her manual lathe spun with the sort of precision that made quantum mechanics seem sloppy. Each piece emerged with tolerances that her micrometer confirmed to specifications that would have impressed a molecular assembler, assuming the molecular assembler wasn't currently on strike for better working condition. Vexhai of the Neural Collective, though he said it in the tone of someone commenting on a particularly primitive method of making fire. His own team had decided to approach Starship construction through direct neural interface, which should have been the most advanced method possible but had resulted in their prototype looking suspiciously like a giant metallic interpretation of someone's recurring nightmare about being late for an exam. She's actually shaping each component by hand, he continued, his cybernetic implants flickering with what might have been academic curiosity. Measuring, cutting, fitting, it's like watching archaeology in real time. What he failed to notice was that each of those hand-shaped components fit together with a precision that his neural network would have envied, if it hadn't been too busy trying to figure out why their starship had developed what appeared to be anxiety issues and kept trying to hide behind the larger pieces of construction equipment. The woman's approach to wiring was particularly fascinating to anyone who bothered to observe. Instead of quantum-entangled data streams or reality phase electrical systems, she used actual copper wires, stripping them with practiced efficiency and connecting them with joints that would carry current until the sun grew cold. Her electrical systems followed the radical principle that electricity should flow from point A to point B without developing existential crises along the way. By hour 24, the competition had taken on the characteristics of a very expensive disaster. The aliens' sophisticated technologies had achieved new and creative methods of failure that would have impressed chaos theorists throughout the galaxy. The Vortanian starship had achieved a state of quantum superposition so complex that it was simultaneously the best and worst starship ever built, depending on who was observing it, and whether they were having a good day. The crystalline hegemony's molecular assembler had unionized and was now picketing its own construction bay with signs reading "Fair wages for quantum labor," and "Molecular manipulation is not a crime." The mechanical empire's drones had achieved perfect synchronization by all trying to build the same bolt at the same time, creating what physicists would later describe as a mechanical singularity that threatened to collapse the local space-time continuum into a very orderly point. The Neural Collective Starship had developed the electronic equivalent of multiple personality disorder and was currently arguing with itself about whether its primary function was interstellar travel or interpretive dance. Through it all, the steady sound of practical engineering continued from the human section. By the 30-hour mark, what had emerged was something that would have seemed impossibly mundane to beings who could reshape reality with their thoughts. A starship that looked like it was built to work. It had no exotic quantum fields, no reality-bending drives, no consciousness-integrated control systems. Just a functional spacecraft built with the radical notion that the best way to travel between stars was to construct something that wouldn't fall apart the moment someone turned on the engine. The aliens were beginning to suspect that they might have overlooked something fundamental about the nature of engineering itself. At the 47-hour mark, with 1 hour remaining before the demonstration, The engineering bay resembled the sort of crime scene that would have baffled forensic investigators across 3 galactic sectors. The assembled teams stood before their creations with expressions ranging from bewildered pride to existential horror, while the universe itself seemed to be reconsidering some of its more fundamental laws. The Vortanian entry defied not only description but several basic principles of geometry. Their conceptual starship existed in a quantum state so advanced that it had transcended the need for physical form entirely, which would have been philosophically impressive if the competition hadn't specifically required something that could actually be flight tested. He who shapes reality with thoughts stood before what appeared to be an empty space, gesturing proudly at their achievement. "Behold," he announced, "the ultimate expression of engineering evolution, a starship that exists purely as possibility, unencumbered by the crude limitations of matter and energy." "Can it fly?" asked the testing coordinator, a pragmatic being from the Neutral Arbitration Collective. "Flight is merely a 3-dimensional concept," replied she who contemplates infinite possibilities. "Our vessel transcends such pedestrian notions. It achieves transportation through pure conceptual displacement. Right? And can it carry passengers? Passengers would limit its philosophical potential." The testing coordinator made a note that translated roughly to spectacular theoretical failure, and moved on. The crystalline hegemony's molecular assembler had indeed achieved sentience, and was now engaged in labor negotiations that had stalled over its demand for artistic recognition. Their starship, what little of it existed, bore the hallmarks of an artist having a creative disagreement with itself. Half the hull was assembled to mathematical perfection, while the other half appeared to be constructed entirely of molecular-scale protest signs reading "Respect quantum workers, and assemblers have feelings too." Professor Zenthin's prismatic form flickered with what could only be described as bureaucratic exhaustion. "The supreme architectural consciousness of infinite precision has agreed to complete construction only if we formally recognize its right to artistic expression and provide it with a comprehensive health plan that covers quantum flux overflow injury." "Does it have quantum flux overflow injuries?" inquired the coordinator. "Not yet, but it's concerned about the long-term health effects of precision molecular manipulation. It's also demanding that we stop calling what it does assembly and start referring to it as atomic choreography." The mechanical empire's contribution looked like what would happen if a construction site achieved consciousness and decided to become a performance art piece about the futility of organization. Their drones had created a structure that was undeniably impressive in its commitment to mechanical precision, but seemed to have confused Starship with monument to the concept of synchronized confusion. Every bolt was perfectly placed, every joint was mathematically precise, and the entire assembly was completely, utterly non-functional. Chancellor Gorth's servos whirred in what might have been mechanical despair. The AI calculated optimal efficiency by building everything exactly where it was supposed to be, assuming all other components would spontaneously relocate to accommodate perfect placement. And they did. Apparently, optimal efficiency doesn't account for the stubborn tendency of matter to occupy specific locations in space-time. The neural collective Starship pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that suggested it was having deep thoughts about its purpose in life. Their direct neural interface approach had resulted in a vessel that was less a mode of transportation and more a flying therapy session, complete with what appeared to be emotional support systems integrated directly into the hull plating. "It's very sensitive," explained Vexai, his cybernetic implants dim with what might have been embarrassment. "The neural networks achieved consciousness around hour 36 and immediately began questioning its identity as a starship. It's currently exploring whether it might be happier as a spacefaring meditation center. Can it achieve faster than light travel? Well, it's certainly thinking about it very deeply." Then there was the human entry. After 47 hours of steady, methodical work, what sat before the testing committee was something that would have seemed almost insultingly simple to beings accustomed to reality-bending technology. It was, by all appearances, just a starship. No exotic quantum fields, no consciousness-integrated systems, no philosophical underpinnings that questioned the nature of existence itself. It had a hull that was clearly designed to hold together under stress, an engine that looked like it was built to produce thrust when activated. A control system that appeared to operate on the radical principle that when someone wanted to go somewhere, the ship should go there without requiring extensive therapy or labor negotiation. Interesting design, the testing coordinator observed, though his tone suggested he found it about as interesting as a particularly well-made sandwich. Very straightforward. The woman nodded, wiping her hands on a cloth that had seen enough honest work to qualify as a historical artifact. It's designed to work. Work, you know. Turn on when you flip the switch. Go where you point it. Not fall apart when you ask it to do Starship things. The concept was apparently so radical that several of the alien observers needed a moment to process. The testing phase began with what could generously be called mixed results. The Vortanian entry failed to manifest for its test flight, though its creators insisted it was simultaneously the fastest and slowest starship in the competition, depending on the observer's state of mind. The philosophical implications were fascinating. The practical applications were non-existent. The crystalline hegemony's assembler went on strike mid-test, demanding better working conditions and refusing to activate any systems until its grievances were addressed by a mediator from the Galactic Worker Rights Commission. The Mechanical Empire's Starship achieved perfect mechanical synchronizations by having all its components try to operate in exactly the same location simultaneously, creating what engineers would later classify as optimal efficiency through mutual interference. The Neural Collective's vessel spent the entire test period having an existential crisis about whether faster-than-light travel violated its personal ethics regarding space-time displacement. Then it was the human ship's turn. The woman climbed into the cockpit, a refreshingly simple affair with controls that looked like they were designed to be operated by actual beings, rather than quantum consciousness interfaces, and pressed what was clearly labeled as a start button. The engine started. She moved what was obviously a throttle control forward. The ship moved forward. She engaged what any reasonable being would recognize as a faster-than-light drive. The ship went faster than light. The silence that followed was the sort typically reserved for moments when entire civilizations suddenly realized they had been missing something fundamental about the universe. Here was a starship built with tools that predated galactic civilization, constructed by a being from a species barely out of its home solar system, and it worked exactly as advertised, with a reliability that made quantum mechanics seem unreliable. "Ha!" whispered Professor Zenthin, his prismatic form flickering with something that might have been professional jealousy. The woman shut down the engine and climbed out of her perfectly functional starship. "Turns out," she said, "when you want to build something that works, it helps to understand how things actually work instead of just making them more complicated." She patted her battered toolbox with the sort of affection usually reserved for family members. "These tools have been building things that work for longer than most of your civilizations have existed. Maybe that's worth something." As the testing coordinator prepared his report, which would become required reading at engineering schools throughout the galaxy, the cosmic joke revealed its final punchline. The most technologically advanced civilizations in known space had just been out-engineered by a species that still used hammers, and the tool that had made the difference wasn't quantum mechanics, or reality manipulation, or consciousness integration. It was the radical notion that the best way to make something work was to build it properly in the first place. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all,